Hello and welcome to this session in which we will discuss how fraud is discovered and what's the role of the auditor in discovering fraud. And we would look at interview techniques that the auditor might utilize when fraud is involved. So what is the reality of fraud detection? So who discovers fraud? That's the first thing to know. Well, who do you think discovers fraud? I'm going to ask you this question before we look at some research. Okay, let's take a look at this. Now, contrary to common belief, okay, auditors are not typically the first line of defense. There are other mechanisms, other factors that lead to the uncovery of fraud. So, what do you think those other factors are? Well, guess what? 40% of the fraud, approximately 40%, is discovered by anonymous tip. Now, the source of this information is the Association of Certified Fraud Examiner. So depending which year you are looking at this is, I believe, early 2000 till 2014 in that ballpark. But this is, I would assume the percentages are the same, but you can go to the ACFE website and look at the percentages because they could change from year to year. But anonymous tip represent the largest. The largest comes from anonymous tip. Someone at the company tips the auditor. Management review, the company itself, proactive review by management, like internal auditor, contribute to about 15% of the fraud detection. They help in spotting inconsistencies in financial record or operational behavior. And that should make sense because management and internal auditor should be the most people interested and familiar with the financial reporting, so that I'm not surprised. There's no surprise there. So management, and I said internal auditor would account approximately 15%. So while internal auditor can contribute to fraud detection, the role account for another 15. They are more closely involved to day-to-day operation. Now keep in mind, not all internal auditors in all companies are the same. We'll talk about the role of the internal auditor later. In some companies, they give them more power. In other companies, they give them less power. In some companies, they give them more budget, more money, which will give them more power, more independence. Other companies don't. But on average, 15%, just like management. Accidental discovery. There we go. About 10% of the fraud is detected purely by accident, highlighting the role or chance in uncovering fraudulent activity. So between anonymous tip and accidental discovery, that's 50% of the fraud. And let's take a look at the external audit. 3%, small amount of fraud is detected by external auditor. What does that mean? It means we have to be aware of the role that the auditor play. The external auditor, they give reasonable assurance. So their job is not to detect fraud unless you are engaged to specifically detect fraud. That most likely will find the fraud if fraud exists, and that's your assignment. But as an external auditor, if you are conducting a plain vanilla audit, yes, you might discover fraud. You might discover it maybe by accident, just like 10% is discovered, or you might discover it through your work. As you go through the audit, you will discover the fraud. Remember, fraud is hidden. Fraud is hidden. That's why it's harder to detect, because the auditor is not looking at everything. They could accidentally discover it, or they could discover it through their hard work, or someone else could give them a tip. Someone at the company. Now keep in mind, anonymous tip comes either from management or internal auditor. So all these sources are interrelated. The main point here is it's not the external auditor, contrary to popular belief, because when you ask someone who detects fraud, they would say, oh, the auditor, not the external auditor. Okay, so we would look in this session, what's the role of auditor in fraud investigation and what happened when they uncovered fraud? What techniques do they use? Let's go ahead and get started. Before we proceed any further, I have a public announcement about my company, farhatlectures.com. Hello, my name is Farhat. You are here because you are either an accounting student, a finance student, or someone who's studying for their CMA or CPA exam. Great. You are looking for some additional help, and we can help you. I strongly encourage you to visit my website, farhatlectures.com. I offer additional lectures, resources, including PowerPoint slides, multiple choice questions, in some circumstances, exercises, and true-false questions.
Our material is aligned with your CPA review courses, with your CMA review courses, with your college courses. I offer a risk-free trial that you can try to find out whether my website can help you or not. If you find it helpful, you subscribe, you keep your subscription. If not, you cancel and your risk is free. If you like this recording, if you like my lectures, you would like what's on the website, give me a chance to help you with your college courses as well as professional certification. I hope to see you on the website.
So the auditor's role is this. Once it's suspected, now it becomes a different ball game. Why? Because now you want to gather and assess evidence related to the fraud, because now you're looking at it at this situation. Once a fraud is uncovered in payroll, in purchasing, in fixed asset, now you're looking at things differently. The way you talk to people, the strategy that you utilize, so on and so forth. But one of the things that you will start with is interviewing. You'll start to ask questions. And this is what we'll discuss in this session. 3 types of questions that you could have, 3 types of inquiries: informational inquiry, assessment inquiry, and interrogative inquiry. And notice you're going to see that as you go from informational to assessment, from assessment to interrogating people, it's going to be different depending on what level are you on. So you don't have to start with interrogative inquiry. So what will you do first? Informational inquiry. What's informational inquiry? To collect general information about the process or event. Or what you're doing here is, when you are interviewing and suspecting fraud, you are using open-ended questions. You are trying to collect as much information as possible to come up with a comprehensive response to learn more about the process. All what you're doing is you're gathering information through open-ended questions. Example will be, could you describe how this process is normally conducted? What steps are taken when discrepancies are noticed? So just basically learning about the process first. How did these transactions recorded and stored? So just learning and to collect as much information as possible. This is called informational inquiry. Then after the informational inquiry, you might move into the assessment inquiry. Here, you ask them questions about what they do. Maybe during the same interview or another day, you would ask them about verify the accuracy of the information already obtained. So now you post follow-up question based on the initial responses. So after they give you this information, this is what they gave you. Now you follow up with a little bit more specific. You stated that these reviews are done weekly. Can you explain what exactly you look for during these reviews? Now you're looking for more specific information based on the information you collected in the informational inquiry. The third type of interrogative inquiry is, here you want to confirm or refute suspicion or deception. Now you are looking to see if they are lying, if they are omitting information. Here you are asking direct questions, often used when deceit is suspected. Now if you think they are lying based on what they told you initially, then you think they are lying. Here you want to ask, is it true that you bypass normal procedure of these transactions? Please answer yes or no. Here what you're trying to do is asking them, answer yes or no. Based on what you told me, are you doing this yes or no? This is interrogative inquiry. And obviously you don't have to carry a gun. This is Jack Bauer. This is from a movie. But the point is, now you are trying to trying to get the information that you need from them based on prior suspicion. Now, I'm going to show you some verbal and non-verbal cues. I'll tell you this about these verbal and non-verbal cues. I attended so many different conferences that I have professional investigators, FBI agent, IRS agent, ATF agents, all sorts of agents that talk about interviews. Some of these agents, they swear by these recognizing deceptive verbal and non-verbal cues, and some they say those are useless. Regardless, I want you to be familiar with them and use your own judgment. So those are how to recognize deception during an interview, looking at verbal cues. So when the person that you're interviewing use extensive use of modifiers like generally, usually, often, normally, What does that mean? How should that be interpreted? Generally speaking, generally speaking, right? Generally speaking, the auditor should probe further to determine whether the use of the modifier indicate that there are exceptions to the process or circumstances being examined. So when they say generally or usually, it means, are you implying we have exceptions? This is what you have to look for. They're telling you there are exceptions. It's not always. Always means always. Usually, normally means there are exceptions. If the person being interviewed frequently rephrasing the question, so rephrasing of the auditor questions by the interviewee, what should that tell you? Skilled auditor recognize that rephrasing often indicate that the interviewee is uncertain about his or her response or attempting to stall for time. So when they are rephrasing, so you ask them a question, they will ask the question again. It could be they want to make sure they understand your question. I do that sometimes. Someone asks me a question, I'll say, okay, I just want to make sure I understand your question. Is this your question? Especially in a classroom when someone asks a question because you want to answer their question. But if you are being investigated for fraud and the person is rephrasing, they could be buying time to think about the answer. If the person being interviewed use filler terms, well, to tell you the truth, etc., and similar ones, auditor should be alert for those fillers, given that they often suggest that the interviewee is hesitant or unable to respond. This tells you that the person you are interviewing, whether it's suspected or a witness, the interviewee, whoever you're interviewing, they may not be able to respond. That's why they're just they're hesitant. Shows you hesitation. If the person is saying, I'm nervous, I just can't remember, acknowledgement of nervousness, when this continues to occur, auditor should be concerned about the possibility of deception. Again, possibility. It doesn't mean it's deception, possibility of deception. Tolerant attitude. It depends on the circumstances. So if the person saying, well, it depends on the circumstances, and overquire responses such as to the best of my memory, when they say this, dishonest people are often tolerant towards someone who may have committed fraud. So when they say it depends on the circumstances, it means it could be right, it could be wrong, depending on the circumstances. It means the person that you're interviewing might have some tolerance toward fraud. It could be, or to the best of my memory. That's another statement. Reluctance to end the interview. When the person being interviewed reluctant, they don't want to end the interview because someone who has honest generally is ready to terminate an interview. These trying to deceive may try to continue the inquiry to convince the auditor that they are telling the truth. So that's also another indicator. So those are verbal cues. Again, some investigators, professional investigators, swear by them. Some people, they say they're useless. What should you do? Now you want to go to Farhat Lectures, look at additional resources to help you whether you are an accounting student, CPA exam candidate. The best investment you make is invest in yourself. Good luck, study hard, and of course, stay safe.